Hello, and welcome again to the Andrew Richter Show. As you can see, Andrew Richter, the star of the show, is here on my right, and we have once again Jason Bradley to join us and enter into a discussion that we hope you will not only enjoy, but learn something from.
We always learn when the three of us are together. That goes without saying.
We are rapidly approaching the 100th anniversary of some significant federal legislation that we believe has propelled the federal government toward massive expansion. Now, we have seen the result of that over many years, and there are many things in addition that have contributed to it. But there were a number of things that happened in 1913 that really got the ball rolling. Maybe, Andrew, you could highlight a couple of those things.
Well, sure. I think one thing, it's probably hard to believe today, but prior to 1913, Americans had little contact with their federal government.
Right. They had little need for contact with the federal government.
But I mean, you may have only encountered the federal government if you served in the armed forces, dealt with the post office, dealt with customs. We had tariffs and things back then. But outside of that, you had very little contact with your federal government. Well, 1913 was a point of no return as far as federal government power. Three significant things happened that year. We had two constitutional amendments, one for the direct election of United States senators. Prior to that, they were chosen by the state legislatures. And
right, you mean, okay, now, we're in an election year, and we have either just elected a senator by popular vote. Now, you're saying that wasn't always the case?
No, they were chosen by the original intent of the Constitution was that the House of Representatives would be your direct representation. The president would be indirect representation of the people, and the Senate was set up to represent the states, that every state was created equally. When the Constitution was being debated, Benjamin Franklin set up a committee, and that committee was how to reconcile popular vote with all states being equal, or all states having a say in the federal government. And out of that came the two legislative branches, the House being the popular, the Senate being the states.
Gee, that almost sounds like a union of states.
Yes.
That is. So for anybody that has felt, well, what about states' rights? Well, they went out the door with that amendment.
Right, and what filled the vacuum was party loyalty, special interest groups, political ambition, and representing states went out the window. I mean, does anybody really think that your senator, whoever that is, whether you voted for them or not, really represents Minnesota first? No, it's party loyalty, it's who financed them, and it's become a millionaires club because you can't run for the Senate anymore without $10 to $20 million of money. So if you're not personally wealthy, you spend your whole time raising money, and because of campaign limits, which limit our First Amendment right to petition government, a very select people can run for the Senate. But representing states is something that doesn't happen anymore.
Okay, so we lost that in 1913.
Well, we also, something else happened.
Did we gain anything?
No, we didn't gain much.
No.
Well, we gained...
Maybe a new tax?
We gained, just going to mention that, we gained the income tax. The federal government, there was a court case, there was a tariff passed in 1894 called the Wilson-Gorman tariff that actually had in it a provision for a 2% income tax. The Supreme Court invalidated it, saying that the Constitution did not allow, I mean, imagine the Supreme Court actually interpreting the Constitution not to fit their politics, that the Constitution did not grant the federal government power to impose a direct tax. Now, we had an income tax before in the Civil War, but it was considered an emergency measure because of the war, and it was dropped in 1866.
Right.
It did not stay
It was
with
sunsetted.
Yes. It was for the war only. And so that led to the movement that, okay, we want to tax people directly, we have to change the Constitution. So that came also in 1913. The power, and it's abused every single day. It's the most discriminatory thing that we have. Discriminates against people based on whether or not they're married, whether or not they're have children, or the head of household, or how they get their income, because different incomes are taxed differently. Capital gains and all that kind of stuff. So two people can make the same amount of money and pay completely different taxes. So it's another abuse, another gift from 1913.
Well, and with that amendment, I mean, wasn't it passed over Christmas?
It actually,
Yeah, I think so.
it actually was. No, the Federal Reserve Act was the one.
The
that was
Federal
passed.
Reserve
Oh,
Act.
okay.
We'll get
Okay,
to
we'll
that
get
one
to
in a
we'll get
moment.
to that.
Oh,
Well, it blew. I don't know. I don't have the calendar of how the legislatures approved it, but
Yeah.
I know it took a while for that to get through.
Yep.
In fact, Minnesota was one of the last ones to ratify that amendment.
And there were states that didn't ratify it.
Right. There were states like Florida, for instance, that never ratified.
And coincidentally, they have no state income tax in Florida.
Isn't that
Coincidence?
interesting?
Yeah.
But it took, the amendment was originally passed in July of '09, and it wasn't ratified by a sufficient number of states until February of '13.
Yep. It took 3.5 years to get it through, which is interesting because nowadays the federal government just does whatever they want. They don't bother amending the Constitution anymore.
right.
Nobody even questions whether government can do anything. So, I mean, I'll give it to them. At least they follow the proper process, thanks to the Supreme Court, interpreting the law rather than making it. And keeping up with the bad news, another thing was created in 1913. It was actually conceived in 1910 by a bunch of bankers, and that was called the Federal Reserve Act, which forever changed our monetary. Prior to that, we had national banks. We had it, Alexander Hamilton pushed the first one, which was killed off by Jefferson and his people. And the second one was created, and Andrew Jackson shut that one down.
Yep.
And then we had the gold, free silver movement of the William Jennings Bryan era, but none of those national banks had the power of the Federal Reserve, not even close.
Right. And well, those central banks weren't created by and owned by bankers. Everyone thinks that, oh, this is part of the government. Well, it's true that the president appoints a head to the Federal Reserve, but really the Federal Reserve is privately owned.
Yes, it's got their own board of directors.
Absolutely. It's not a government entity.
So it does what it wants to, not what the government says it should.
Yeah, well, there's no direct accountability to the citizens.
Yeah, there is no even an audit of the Federal Reserve.
That's what I was going to say. Anyone who wants to try and audit it can't. They have to try and pass something in Congress to go and audit it, which
Has
it's
been
passed
done.
the House twice, and
Yeah.
it can't get it past the Senate.
And by the way, the last time it passed the House, it got almost 350 votes. I mean, this isn't one party or anything like that. 350 votes is a lot to get in
Yeah.
the House on anything, and they won't take it up in the Senate. So
We have no idea how much gold, like hard gold, this country still owns because they can't get the numbers from the Federal Reserve.